Chapter 26 of the Life of Thomas, Lord Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald, completing the Autobiography of a Seaman, Volume 2, by Henry Richard Fox Bourne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. 1839 to 1848. The restoration of his naval rank to the Earl of Dundonald in 1832 was slowly followed by other acts reversing the injustice of previous years, by which a large portion of his life had been embittered. "Your Lordship in the Admiralty," he wrote to Lord Minto, then the head of naval affairs, on the 30th of March, 1839, "may be surprised that I have never solicited any appointment since my reinstatement in the naval service by his late Majesty, whose memory I shall ever cherish, for this magnanimous act of justice. The cause, my Lord, has not been from any reluctance on my part, but from a feeling which I have no doubt will appear satisfactory to your Lordship, if you do me the favour to read this enclosed copy of a letter which I have written this day to the Marquess of Lansdowne, as President of the Council." The letter to Lord Lansdowne referred in great part to Lord Dundonald's rotary engine and to his secret war plan, which he expressed his willingness to put into execution if ever it was required. "Your Lordship in the Privy Council, however," it was added, "will not fail to observe that, if it shall ever be the intention of the Government, under any circumstances, again to employ me in the naval service, it would be quite inconsistent with the character of that service, as well as my own reputation, for me to assume command, unless the Order of the Bath, gained on the 12th of April, 1809, now 30 years ago, shall be restored to me." "I hope it will appear to your Lordship," said Lord Dundonald, in a letter to Lord Melbourne, dated the 11th of July, 1839, "that my services as a naval officer have been useful and honourable to my country, and, referring to those services, and to the peculiar opportunities I have since had of acquiring further professional knowledge, I may say without vanity that Her Majesty has no officer in her navy more experienced than myself. And yet, from the extraordinary circumstances of my case, I am the only flag officer in Her Majesty's service who, if called upon to take a command, could not do so consistently with his own honour and the respect due to those who might be appointed to serve under him. For whereas the officer who could not conveniently call to mind that I, who when only a captain was a Knight of the Bath, was deprived of that honour, and that now, though a flag officer, I have not been deemed worthy of having it restored. I am sensible," wrote Lord Dundonald in another letter to the Premier, written 8 days later, "that the act of justice which I experienced from the late King, under the ministry of Earl Grey, of which your Lordship was a distinguished member, in restoring me to my naval rank was a great favour, inasmuch as it evinced a considerable feeling towards me, and I was then fully satisfied with it, under the impression that it would be viewed by the public, and especially by the Navy, as a testimony of the belief of the Government at that time that I was innocent of the offence that had been laid to my charge, and also that I should stand as good a chance as most of my brother officers, and perhaps from my experience a better, of being called to active service. I did not then foresee that the restoration of my naval rank alone would be viewed as a half measure. Still less did I anticipate that, in the event of my being offered an appointment, I should be incapacitated from accepting it by reason of the feelings of other officers, that I still laboured under some imputation which would render it derogatory to them to serve under me. But it is now impossible for me to conceal from myself the fact that, while the Navy generally is kindly disposed towards me, and would rejoice to see me fully reinstated in all that I once enjoyed, I am considered by many to remain as completely precluded from active service as if my name had never more appeared in the Navy List. I trust, my Lord, that it cannot be thought reasonable to reduce me to the inglorious condition of a retired or yellow admiral at home, and at the same time to deny me the privilege of acquiring either emolument or distinction in foreign service." Lord Dundonald's hope was that, on the occasion of Her Majesty's marriage, there would be a bestowal of honours which would afford a convenient opportunity for the restoration of his dignity as a Knight of the Bath, but in this he was disappointed. A minor favour was conferred upon him, however, and in a very gratifying way, 18 months later. "You are probably aware," wrote Lord Minto to him on the 3rd of January, 1841, "that the death of Sir Henry Bantam has vacated one of the pensions for good and meritorious service. Before I left town a few days ago, I made my arrangements to enable me to confer this pension upon you, if you should think it worthy of your acceptance, either as evidence of the high esteem in which I have ever held your services, or as convenient in a pecuniary point of view. Although you are one of the few who have not applied for this, I do not fear that any one of the numerous claimants can show so good a title to it." That compliment was accepted by Lord Dundonald in a spirit answering to that in which it was offered. Yet his reasonable anxiety for a restitution of the Order of the Bath was not abated, and thereupon he was engaged in a correspondence with the Earl of Haddington, then First Lord of the Admiralty, during the early part of 1842, which was closed by the intimation, bitterly disappointing to Lord Dundonald, that the Cabinet Council declined recommending to the Queen to comply with his earnest request. Equally disappointing was the result of another application with the same object, which he made to Sir Robert Peel in the autumn of 1844. "Her Majesty's servants," wrote Sir Robert Peel on the 7th of November, "have had under consideration the letter which I received from your Lordship, bearing date the 10th of September. On reference to the proceedings which were adopted in the year 1832, it appears that, previously to the restoration of your Lordship to your rank in the Navy, a free pardon under the Great Seal was granted to your Lordship, and advertising to that circumstance, and to the fact that 30 years have now elapsed since the charges to which the free pardon had reference were the subject of investigation before the proper judicial tribunal of the country, Her Majesty's servants cannot, consistent with their duty, advise the Queen to reopen an inquiry into those charges." Lord Dundonald failed to see in the partial reversal 12 years before of the unjust treatment to which he had been subjected 18 years before that a reason for refusing to inquire whether there was any injustice yet to be atoned for. He had not, however, very much longer to wait for the object which he sought. One of the grounds for desiring a public recognition of the efficacy of his secret war plans was a reasonable belief that, if it was seen that through half a lifetime he had steadfastly avoided using for his private advantage what might have been to him a vast source of wealth, in order that the secret might be reserved solely for the benefit of his country, it would be acknowledged to be incredible that, for insignificant ends, he could have resorted to the gross and clumsy fraud attributed to him at the Stock Exchange trial. And in this expectation he was right. Nearly all the reparation that was now possible quickly followed upon the investigation into the war plans that was referred to in the last chapter. While the investigation was pending, he was pained by a letter from Sir Thomas Hastings, not unkind in itself, but showing that his real motives for courting that investigation were not understood. "I made a communication today," wrote Sir Thomas on the 27th of November, 1846, "that the Commission had entered on its duties and received instructions to inform you that it would be desirable, before the Commission proceeded further, to ascertain your Lordship's views as to the nature of the remuneration you would expect from the Government in the event of your plans being reported on favourably." Lord Dundonald's reply was characteristic. "You intimate a wish on the part of the Government," he wrote on the 1st of December, "to ascertain my views in regard to the remuneration I expect in the event of my plans being favourably reported on. I replied that I had devoted these plans 35 years ago to the service of my country, that I have reserved them through the most adverse and trying circumstances, satisfied that at some future time I should prove my character to be above pecuniary considerations or mercenary motives. I have looked forward to the restitution of those honours of which I was most unjustly bereaved, and to freedom from mental anguish endured throughout an isolation from society of 1/3 a century. I cannot contrast with such sufferings, nor with my plans, any sum the Government could bestow. Nevertheless, I have implicitly relied that collateral deprivations and losses would be taken into consideration by some future just and impartial administration. I do most earnestly hope that the period has now arrived." That letter was communicated by Sir Thomas Hastings to Lord Auckland. "I return the letter," he wrote to Sir Thomas on the 16th of December, "which Lord Dundonald wrote to you upon the remuneration he would expect in the event of a favourable report upon his plans, namely, first, his restoration to the honours of which he was deprived, and secondly, a consideration of collateral deprivations and losses. I am sorry to acquaint you that the first condition is one to which I am not authorized to promise an acquiescence. It is not necessary that I should discuss the difficulties which occurred to the restoration in question. I can only express my own deep regret that they should exist, and that the hopes which have been entertained by Lord Dundonald should be disappointed. For myself, I personally regard him. I look upon his naval career as most remarkable and most honourable, and I must lament whatever may seem to detract from the advantage and grace of his return to the Navy." Sir Thomas Hastings, wrote Lord Dundonald to Lord Auckland on the following day, has sent me your sympathising note on the decision of the Cabinet Council in regard to the first item, designated as the remuneration I would expect in the event of a favourable report on my plans. Now, after the expression of my deep sense of gratitude to your lordship for having brought the question before the Cabinet, I do most sincerely rejoice that the first condition is one to which you are not authorized to promise an acquiescence. I could not deem acquiescence a remuneration, nor could I value it otherwise than as evidence of conviction, produced by facts and the tenor of a whole life, of my incapacity of descending to base acts for gain at any period of my existence, especially at the moment when I can prove that I had objects of the highest national importance and most brilliant personal prospects in view. In confirmation of disinterestedness, I further hold my retention of the secret war plans for a period of 35 years, notwithstanding frequent opportunities to use them to my incalculable private advantage. The merit of these plans, though I am well aware of their value, is yet officially unpronounced by the commission appointed to report. Therefore, the preceding facts being doubtful, I repeat that I do most sincerely rejoice that the Cabinet Council have manifested that their decision depends neither on favour nor on the value of the plans themselves. Foreseeing that whatever may be the ultimate determination, it must be founded on facts and justified by the exposition of my conduct and character, I am preparing a document which, whatever may be my fate pending the brief remainder of my existence, will justify my memory when grievous wrongs shall cease to prey on a mind which, save from the consciousness of rectitude, would in a brief time have bowed my head with humiliation to the ground. The document there referred to was a pamphlet entitled Observations on Naval Affairs and on some Collateral Subjects. In it were concisely enumerated Lord Dundonald's services as a British naval officer, and the hardships brought upon him by the unmerited Stock Exchange trial. The pamphlet was published in February 1847, and immediately excited considerable attention. "I hope the difficulties which have prevented the realization of your wishes may be removed shortly," wrote Sir Thomas Hastings on the 2nd of March. "But services so distinguished and a career so splendid and full of professional instruction as your lordship's can never be blotted out or rendered dim in the annals of the naval history of our country." "I have had the kindest note possible from the Marquess of Lansdowne," said Lord Dundonald in a letter written on the 27th of April. "Lord Auckland was at our house on Saturday, and he spoke in the kindest and most feeling manner. I hear from all quarters that the pamphlet has made and is making a great impression, and I have every hope that all will end well." All did end well. The public announcement on the highest authority of the value of his secret war plans, and the consequent exhibition of his disinterested patriotism in so long preserving them for his country's use, followed by the bold appeal made by him to the public through his pamphlet, brought success at last to his long-continued efforts to obtain a restoration of his dignity as a Knight of the Bath. His best friends in the Cabinet, especially Lords Lansdowne and Auckland, had influence, though not all the influence they desired, upon other Cabinet and Privy Councillors who were opposed to the tardy act of justice. But they did not wait for the assent of all. On the 6th of May, Lord Lansdowne represented the case to Her Majesty the Queen, and received her promise that, with or without the approval of her Privy Councillors, she would confer the next vacant Order of the Bath upon Lord Dundonald. Fortunately, a vacancy occurred immediately through the death of Admiral Sir Davidge Gould. "Lord Auckland has called," wrote Lord Dundonald on the 9th of May, "and informed me officially that the Queen has placed at his disposal the vacant Order of the Bath, and that, in conformity with the intention with which it was so placed, he was to deliver it to me. I have information from the Palace," he wrote a few days later, "that Her Majesty has had the conversation as to the justice of some further atonement for the injuries that have been inflicted on me, and that she said it was subject of regret, and such was not in her power, but should the subject be entertained by her advisers, her concurrence would not be wanting." That further act of justice was never rendered, but Lord Dundonald rejoiced that the more important measure, that which, by restoring the dignity wrongfully taken from him, would do more than anything else to set him right in the eyes of the world, was at last adopted. "It gives me sincere pleasure," wrote Lord John Russell on the 12th of May, in answer to a letter thanking him for the conduct of his administration, "that the last act of the Government has been so gratifying to you. Your services to your country are recorded among those of the most brilliant of a war, signalized by heroic achievements. I will lay before Her Majesty the expression of your gratitude, and I can assure you that the Queen has sanctioned with the greatest satisfaction the advice of her ministers." Letter ends. On the 25th of May, the order being dated the 22nd, Lord Dundonald was gazetted as a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, and this act of grace was rendered more graceful by the personal interest shown by Prince Albert, who, as Grand Master of the Order, dispensed with the customary formalities and delays, and on the following morning caused a warrant to be sent to him in order that he might wear the cross at the birthday drawing-room, which he attended by Her Majesty's command on the 27th of May. Thus another step was made in the way of retribution for the injuries inflicted on him in 1814 and in the ensuing years. "Today," he wrote on the 12th of July, "there was a grand muster at the palace of all the Knights' Grand Crosses, and many inferior crosses, and I was installed. Lord Ellenborough was one of my sponsors, and the Duke of Wellington shook hands with me and expressed his satisfaction at my restoration to the order. I am glad to tell you that the ceremony of knighting, of which I was afraid, was not resorted to. So my knightship dates back to the 27th of April, 1809. Letter ends. In another effort to obtain full justice for himself, however, he was unsuccessful. The great expenses that sprung out of his long-continued scientific and mechanical pursuits had absorbed all his scanty sources of income, and he was forcibly urged that, in accordance with the precedent furnished by a similar grant to Sir Robert Wilson in 1832, he was entitled to the arrears of pay due to him for the 17 years during which he had been kept out of his position in the British Navy. But his request was refused, and the heavy pecuniary loss, as well as other and much heavier deprivations, consequent on a persecution that has ever since admitted to have been wholly undeserved, has never been compensated." Part of a letter which Lord Dundonald received on this subject 4 years afterwards from Mr. Joseph Hume, though quoted in his Autobiography, is too important to be here omitted. "I considered," wrote the great champion of public economy on the 10th of May, 1852, "that you were incapable of taking the means that were resorted to by Mr. Cochrane Johnson, and for which you suffered, and I was pleased to learn that you had been restored to your rank. I considered that act a proof that the government, which had restored you to the rank and honours of your profession, and had afterwards appointed you to the command in the West Indies, must have come to the same conclusion. Until the perusal of your draft petition, I concluded that you had all your arrears paid to you as a tardy, though inadequate, return to your lordship, whose early exploits did honour to yourself, and gave lustre to the naval service of the country to which you belonged. His Majesty King William IV. Was satisfied with the innocence of Sir Robert Wilson, and he was restored to the service, was, I understand, paid all the arrears of pay and allowances during his suspension, and afterwards appointed to the command of Gibraltar. I was pleased at the result, and it would give me equal pleasure to learn that your application to Her Majesty should be attended with an act of justice to you equally merited." Lord Palmerston subsequently, in answer to an application from Lord Dundonald, forgetting Sir Robert Wilson's case, said there was no precedent for such an act. Lord Dundonald answered that there was no precedent for such injustice as had been done to him. Shortly after that event, Lord Dundonald sought to be elected one of the Scotch representative peers in the House of Lords. Now that his load of unmerited disgrace was shaken off, he desired to resume his old functions as a legislator, and this with no abatement of his zeal for the welfare of the people, but with none of the violence which his own heavy sufferings at the time of their first and heaviest pressure had partially caused him to show during his former parliamentary career. Being now a peer, he could not return to his seat in the House of Commons, and being a Scotch peer, he could only sit in the House of Lords as one of the delegates from the aristocracy of his native land. Among these he therefore asked for a place at the election in September 1847. He did not, however, begin to seek it early enough. Other candidates had, according to custom, obtained promises of a majority of votes from electors before he thought of canvassing, and he was thus left in a minority. Many peers, however, who on this occasion were unable to support him, offered to pledge their votes to him for the next election. A minor favour was at this time shown to Lord Dundonald, which afforded him real gratification. In 1835 he had been allowed by King William IV. to use the insignia of a Grand Commander of the Order of the Saviour of Greece, conferred upon him by King Otho. In August 1847 he applied to the Cabinet for permission to use the title of Marquess of Maranham and the Grand Cross of Brazil, both of which had been conferred upon him by the Emperor Pedro I. in 1823. "I have to acquaint your lordship," wrote Lord Palmerston, then Foreign Secretary, on the 11th of October, "that under the peculiar circumstances of the case, which have prevented the application being made earlier, the Queen has signified her pleasure that you should be permitted to accept the Grand Cross of the Order of the Cruzeiro, with regard however, to the title of Marquis of Maranham, it is my duty to state to your lordship that, after full consideration, Her Majesty's Government regret that they cannot advise the Queen to grant you the desired permission. While Her Majesty's Government duly appreciate the services rendered by your lordship to the Crown of Brazil, they consider it to be on general principles so undesirable that distinguished officers of the British Navy should have foreign titles, that they feel themselves compelled to decline complying with your request. Letter ends. "I beg to assure your lordship," wrote Lord Dundonald in reply on the 18th of October, "that I feel more gratitude in being informed of the sentiment of Her Majesty's Government in regard to my faithful and zealous services in Brazil than I ever experienced from the title conferred on me as the honorary portion of my reward for such services. As far as it relates to assuming the title in my native country, I entreat your lordship to believe I never entertained the intention." Letter ends. A memorable occurrence soon followed. Now that his honours, as well as his naval rank, were restored to him, he had no reason of holding back from active service in his profession, and the Earl of Auckland, anxious to make use, as far as use could be made in peacetime, of his great and varied experience, and also to give further proof of the desire at last to render him all possible honour, was prompt in offering him fresh employment on the sea. "I shall shortly have to name a commander-in-chief for the North American and West Indian station," wrote Lord Auckland on the 27th of December, 1847. "Will you accept the appointment? I shall feel it to be an honour and a pleasure to have you named to it, and I am satisfied that your nomination will be agreeable to Her Majesty, as it will be to the country and particularly to the Navy." Letter ends. Lord Dundonald did accept the appointment, rejoicing in it as a further step in reparation for the injuries by which he had been hindered a whole generation before from rising to the highest rank in the naval service of his country. He might then have achieved victories over the French, which would have surpassed his brilliant exploits at Basque Roads. He could now only direct the quiet operations of a small fleet in a time of peace. This, however, being the best that it was now possible for him to do, he gladly undertook. "Permit me," he wrote to Lord Auckland, "to assure your lordship that this gracious act has further tended to obliterate the deep and painful impressions made by 30 years of mental suffering, such as no language can describe. For, my lord, the agony produced by false accusations on an honourable mind is infinitely greater than merited infliction of death itself. I will leave your lordship, then, to estimate the amount of obligation I fail to convey, and beg you to allow me to express a hope that your generous recommendation to Her Majesty will be justified by my zealous endeavours to fulfil the duties I owe to my sovereign and country." Letter ends. "I have waited for Her Majesty's assent to your appointment," said the Earl of Auckland in a letter written on the 3rd of January, 1848, "before answering your letter on the 28th ultimo. This assent has been most cordially given, and you may now consider yourself Commander-in-Chief of the North American and West Indian station, and I may repeat that my share in this proceeding has given me very great pleasure, and that I am confirmed in my feelings of gratification by the terms in which you speak of occupying your former place in the Navy. I am glad for you, and I am glad for myself, that I have done this just and honourable act." Letter ends. Very hearty was the satisfaction expressed by all classes as soon as Lord Dundonald's appointment was made public. "I beg," wrote Mr. Delane, the editor of the Times, earliest of all in tendering his compliments, "to offer my very hearty congratulations upon your appointment, all that remained to efface the stain of such unmerited persecution." "The communication you have just made to me," wrote the Duke of Hamilton and Brandon, "is most gratifying, and the First Lord of the Admiralty has done himself immortal honour in appointing that naval officer commander in one hemisphere who had previously illustrated his name by his most brilliant exploits in the other. Everything, I think, has now been done to undo the foul aspersions with which you have been assailed, and I am sure now everything will be done that can most serve to establish the ability of the officer and the delicacy of the gentleman. I congratulate you most sincerely upon your appointment, and I hope you will meet with difficulties when you arrive at your destination. Don't be surprised at this my wish. It proceeds from knowing the ample resources of my friend to overcome them, and his constant desire to sacrifice everything to duty and honour. I derive the greatest pleasure and satisfaction from your appointment to the command of a British fleet," wrote Sir George Sinclair, "an appointment not less creditable to the ministry than honourable to yourself. I cannot help contemplating with affectionate sorrow the portrait of our dearest friend, Sir Francis Burdett, now suspended over the chimney-piece, and thinking how happy he would have been had he witnessed this most welcome and delightful consummation." "Permit me the honour," wrote Admiral John White, "to bear testimony to the high gratification I feel at seeing by the papers the announcement of your lordship's having taken the command of the West India and Halifax stations. The whole British Empire has expressed great joy at this justice having been done to the bravery of your lordship as an officer, and your goodness and honour as a man." That last sentence told no more than the truth. CHAPTER XXVII. Gold Coast, Australia.